welcome in everyone to just another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is August 14th. We are 9 days away from college football being back underway, and we finally have our last conference to predict. We got the SEC for you today. We'll start with some big-time storylines to watch for. Obviously, there is a huge one that we'll start off with. Then we'll talk about all the tiers as I see it as we head into this season for the SEC. We'll jump into some SEC players to watch, and then we'll finish it out. I'll give my championship pick, give all my superlatives. A very, very tough championship to pick, but at the end of the day, I have my pick. I don't know if everyone's going to love it, but at the end of the day, I feel pretty confident in what I got right now. Let's jump into these storylines, though, because there is quite a few things to break down in this conference. I think the biggest one is known, and it's been talked about almost ad nauseum already, but it is Arch Manning. Arch Manning has gotten all the hype in the world, especially from Paul Feinbaum, who thinks he's God's gift to football, it sounds like. But at the end of the day, this will be talked about as much as anything in college football this year. There's no doubt in my mind. Whether you want to talk about Bill Belichick or Deion Sanders or any of the other big-time storylines in college football, they're dwarfed by this kid. There's no two ways about that. The last name brings a lot of energy, a lot of attention, and a lot of expectations. And it's going to be insane to watch this play out. Good or bad, the noise is going to be very deafening around this kid the entire year. I think some of it is a little bit unwarranted. I think some of it is kind of setting him up to fail to make sure that later in the season, if he's not playing too well, you can make sure that you're bashing him just as good as you're praising him right now. But at the end of the day, you're in a position where he's walking into the season as the most anticipated quarterback in college football history. I think you could argue Tim Tebow. You could argue a couple other guys. They don't come close to this guy. Let's just be totally honest. The last name carries a lot of weight in every level of college football, and that Ohio State game will be fascinating. If he comes out on the first drive, they go 75 yards and they score a touchdown, it's immediately that he's winning the Heisman and doing incredible things. If they go 3 and out or he throws a pick on the first drive, he's a bust. He's the worst player in the world, and no one should have hyped him up. So there's no in between, and it's going to get frustrating for just about everyone, including Texas fans, I have to imagine. It's going to be a very, very big topic of conversation, and there's really no way to avoid it, good or bad, for him this season. Moving on to Georgia and Alabama, just more questions for them as we head into the season than we're normally used to. They're always stacked with talent. That's never going to be a question for them, but the quarterbacks are relatively new. Gunnar Stockton and Ty Simpson has been officially named the quarterback at Alabama. We'll talk more about that tomorrow when we get into all that stuff, but a lot of young players on the defensive side of the ball that have to play big-time roles for them, some new weapons that are going to have to hit big time. There's a lot of questions heading into the season for just about everyone in the country. These two have tended to be a little bit above the fray when it comes to those questions, and to a certain extent they still are, but there's still quite a few questions here, and definitely some that, if they're not answered in the affirmative, then these teams could very well miss the CFP this year. The other big-time thing is the hot seat head coaches. There is quite a few guys that are looking over their shoulder right about now, whether you want to talk about Hugh Freeze or Billy Napier or maybe Brian Kelly. That's a little bit different of a situation, but absolutely someone that has pressure on him at the very least heading into this year. I tend to believe at least 2 guys are going to be fired in the SEC this year, either during the year or at the end of it. Whether that's Hugh Freeze and Billy Napier or Sam Pittman, I think is in a very, very tough spot. People tend to be talking a little bit about Mark Stoops at Kentucky. I think it's going to be really hard for that administration to fire that guy after all he's done for that program, but obviously all of this stuff is very much up in the air. Brent Venables over there at Oklahoma has been a pick. I think that one's a little bit tough because of the buyout, but there's a number of names that you're going to have to watch very, very closely, and if they don't deliver this year, there's going to be a lot of questions around these guys. Whether or not some of them are fired or kept around will be obviously a big-time topic of debate, and even a topic of debate in some of those rooms where they make that decision, but these guys got to deliver. There's no doubt about it. I think the Billy Napier, Hugh Freeze, Sam Pittman, those 3 guys, if none of them hit their win total over, let's say, if none of them get to 8 or 9 wins, I think all of them could be hitting the door. Sam Pittman might have a little bit different of a situation, obviously, but at the end of the day, these guys got to execute or they could be looking for a new job here pretty soon. New quarterbacks all over the place. There are so many guys that are going to make their first SEC start in week 1 or in week 3 or whenever that does happen for them, but 8 out of the 16 teams are getting guys that are going to make their first SEC start this upcoming year. that's a whole lot. And it's a whole lot of variance that is kind of introduced into this conference. Does Ty Simpson hit, or does he fall a little bit short of expectations? Does John Mateer rise to the occasion of an SEC schedule, or is it a little bit too much of a transition from the pseudo Mountain West schedule he was playing a year ago? Can Beau Pribula hit big, or is he going to be an entire whiff? Or could one of these young quarterbacks, Austin Simmons, Gunnar Stockton, Arch Manning, could they take or DJ Lagway if he's fully healthy? Can all of those guys take that next step and become some of the great talents that a lot of us think that they're going to end up being? It's one of these conferences that I think the defenses are kind of the main headline, at least in my opinion. There are so many great defenses across this conference that I think it's going to come down to which quarterback can just play cleaner football, go about their business, not necessarily put the ball in harm's way, and play just really solid football. Just no frills, no craziness, just kind of execute the game plan in front of them. And there's 8 guys that are going to be thrown into the fire this year that they have not been thrown into, and it's going to be really fascinating to watch which ones rise to the moment, which ones shrink away from it. You'll probably find that has a lot to do with which teams find their way to Atlanta and then possibly find their way to the CFP from this conference. This is the most interesting one to me. Who's 10-2 becomes a 7-5? Because I can almost promise you that this is going to happen this year in this conference. There are a lot of teams that expect to go at least 10-2 this year, or 9-3, or at least be in the CFP conversation is probably the best way to put it. One of those teams, or maybe multiple of those teams, are going to go 7-5. I can almost promise you that. Now, I do have a picture of Tennessee there. They're not necessarily my pick to do that because I think that defense is going to be plenty good. But at the end of the day, they are absolutely someone that's up for this award, quote unquote. Not really an award, but at the end of the day, they're in the running for this to possibly happen. I think South Carolina is another team. Maybe Oklahoma, John Mateer doesn't hit the way that they're expecting. South Carolina with a lot of guys moving on. There's quite a few teams that are sitting in this realm of, we did really well last year. We either made the CFP or we're right on the outside looking in. We got to take a step forward. We got to make the CFP again in Tennessee's case, or in Ole Miss or South Carolina's case. We got to make the CFP this year. Got to take that next step that one of them's not going to, or maybe multiple of them are not going to. There's not enough oxygen in the room. There's so many different teams that want to make a CFP run this year. By my count, it's about 12 different teams in this conference that, I don't want to say expect that, but are looking to possibly make a CFP run this upcoming year. That there's not enough oxygen in the room. At some point, a couple of those teams are going to fall, and one of those teams is going to fall like a rock. And we'll figure out who that's going to be, whether it's Tennessee or it's an Auburn team that really needs to execute this year for Hugh Freeze to continue working there, or an A&M team that has a lot of hype going into this year with Marcel Reed. One of those teams, or probably 2 or 3 of those teams, are going to get to the end of the season and just feel like they left so much on the table, lost so many one-score games, and felt like they could have been 10-2 if they made a couple more plays, and they're 7-5, and they're way out of the conversation for the CFP. And then, obviously, returning to the topic of college football is going to be a topic of conversation around the SEC this year. There's a lot of people that are staking a lot on this. Paul Feinbaum said he would leave the country if the SEC did not win the national championship this year. Now, I tend to believe he's probably going to go on a vacation and come on back, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. If Georgia doesn't win the entire thing, obviously their fans don't want the other teams to win it. But as a conference, Greg Sankey and all the people in that office very much want to get back on top of the sport. They are a little sick of hearing the trash talk from the Big Ten, and very warranted trash talk from the Big Ten over the last couple of years. They want to get back on top. I've talked about this before. I tend to believe the SEC has more teams that are capable of winning the national title than the Big Ten. I also think the Big Ten might have 2 or 3 of the best options out of the top maybe 5 options in the country to win the national title. So that's a little bit of a tough spot for them to be put in, but there's plenty of teams that can do it from the SEC. Mainly 4 teams that I'm really circling that absolutely could lift the trophy at the end of the season, and we'll talk about it. Right after this, we'll get into my tiers as I see it in this conference. A very weird conference. One of those that you can break down. I feel like the top tier is pretty much set. I think the middle tier is an absolute nightmare, and we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the big time storylines going into the year for the SEC. As you can imagine, Arch Manning is going to top that list. He's going to be talked about as much as you can talk about one individual on one team. I can promise you that. He is as anticipated of a quarterback as we have seen ever in college football, and it is going to be talked about like that. It already has been talked about like that almost ad nauseum. But at the end of the day, let's get into the tiers as I see it in this conference, because I think the first one is pretty clear cut. I think the second one's an absolute nightmare, and we'll get into that here in a second. But the top four is the big four, as I like to call it. Whenever you're talking about the SEC going into the season, pretty much from the start of the offseason till right now, you're talking about Georgia, Alabama, Texas, and LSU. Now, sometimes people will drop LSU out of that group. They'll just have those three teams in Georgia, Alabama, and Texas in there, but I do think LSU factors into this conversation. I do think they are a good enough team. They have the most experienced quarterback among this group by a very comfortable margin, and they absolutely have upgraded on the defensive side of the ball from a personnel standpoint. We don't know how that'll develop on the field, and that's something to remain to be seen, but this is a team that absolutely can win this conference this year, can even win the national title this year, as far as I'm concerned. So there's these four teams, to me, just stand above the pack. Georgia is always going to be in that realm as long as Kirby Smart's around. Quite a few changes, no doubt about that, but love the young talent they have there. I think KJ Bolden is someone that's going to become a household name by the end of the year. Alabama, Ty Simpson is going to be the quarterback. Everything else looks great. The wide receiver room is elite. The offensive line's as good as you're going to find in the entire country. The running back room, although relatively unknown names outside of Jamarian Miller, I think they're going to be more than fine. I love the defense with veteran and younger talent on it. Bray Hubbard is one of my favorite players in the entire country. They're going to be a very, very good team in Kalen DeBoer's second year. And then you got Texas, obviously going to be in this conversation. Might be the best defense in the entire country. By my estimations, they are the best defense in the entire country heading into this season. And if Arch Manning is 50% of what Paul Feinbaum tells us that he's going to be, this is going to be a really good team, and they're probably going to win the national title. Now, I think he's going to be a really, really good player. We'll see how Paul's takes look at the end of the year, but at the end of the day, these are the four teams, in my mind, that are leading this conference by a pretty comfortable margin in some respects. Then you get to this group, and I call it the CFP or bust group, but some of these might have a little bit more wiggle room than I'm talking about right now. But I do think these 8 fan bases are going into this year saying, why not us? Why can't we make the CFP? And some are a little bit more justified than others. And we'll start with one that's a little bit teetering for me, and that's Auburn. The wide receiver core is as elite as can be. I think it might be the best in the country outside of Columbus, Ohio. And you have the defensive talent with Keldrick Falk, with a couple of other players that are going to play big-time roles for you. I think they have the guys. Even last year, when you're talking about a team that was pretty much top 20 in offense and defense, and just turned over the ball way too much. And it's something that has happened quite a bit with Hugh Freeze teams in the past that he has to get fixed. But at the end of the day, I think that fan base wants to go to the CFP. And I know that fan base wants to go to the CFP this year. How much they're expecting that, I don't know. That's kind of the big time question. Would 8-4 be fine? I know 9-3 would be okay. Are they expecting a CFP berth? I think it's all a little bit all over the place for Auburn. Nonetheless, they are a hugely hyped up team going into this year. They upgraded pretty much across the board when it talks about talent. Another offensive line that's going to be super, super forceful in the run game. I feel pretty good about this team. I don't know exactly where the expectations fall, but I do know they are a team that are looking at the season and saying, why can't we be the next team to make the CFP from the SEC? Why can't we be the 4th or 5th team in this conference that possibly joins that fun at the end of the year? Then you got Florida. If DJ Lagway is healthy, I think this fan base is looking at 10 wins. I think they feel that confident in what they have, and frankly, I might be with them. Now, that could go sour very quickly. Obviously, if you lose that game to Miami, I believe in week 3, if DJ Lagway isn't playing against LSU and you lose that one, things tumble very quickly, and I think Billy Napier tumbles with them. But at the end of the day, I think going into this season, if you were to tell Florida fans you're going to have DJ Lagway fully healthy 100% for all of the games, they would tell you they're going to the playoff. And I think that's not necessarily an overly crazy thing to say. The schedule's an absolute nightmare, but they are a team that is uniquely talented, and I think that fan base, as long as Lagway is healthy, I can't say that enough, as long as he is healthy, will have big time expectations this year. Then you got Missouri. They bought in Bo Pribula, and you look at the schedule, it sets up really nicely for the Tigers. And it's one of those things where I felt like they left a little bit on the table last year. It felt like a team that absolutely was set up with a schedule that was very advantageous, could very much put them in a position to possibly get to the CFP, and they fell a little bit short. Actually, they fell pretty comfortably short of the expectations that I had for them a year ago. They're going to have to upgrade in a number of different places. I think they did a great job in the portal, grabbing a couple of different guys, but it is going to be a tall order for this team. The schedule sets up really nicely, and I think every Missouri fan would tell you right now they expect to at least be in the CFP conversation at the end of the year. Oklahoma, the exact same thing. You bring over John Mateer, you feel confident that your offense is going to be more talented this year. You bring in Jay Knott, that obviously helps as well, and then a couple of guys in the wide receiver room that are going to have to be huge. The offensive line seems to be still not very set, which makes me a little bit nervous, but at the end of the day, I think every Oklahoma fan will look you in the face and say, we are going to be a playoff team this year. John Mateer is going to bring us to that level that we belong at in a lot of respects. So I think Oklahoma fully expects the CFP run, or at least, again, being in that conversation late in the season. Ole Miss barely missed a chance last year. They really got a taste for what it would be like to be in the CFP, and then they kind of snatched it away from themselves when they went down to Gainesville and took that loss to Florida. The reality is they want to be in the CFP this year. There's a lot of change down there. So maybe the fans have a little bit more leniency when it comes to the amount of wins they're expecting this year from Lane Kiffin and company. But at the end of the day, I do think this is a team that was right on the outside last year. They want to jump into the party. And I do think they have the ability to. I also think they have the ability to be the team that falls off a cliff and things just go catastrophically wrong for a number of different reasons. And they're at the end of the year looking up thinking, was last year just kind of an anomaly, or was this an anomaly? So that'll be an interesting thing to watch with them. Same situation with South Carolina. Love Lenora Sellers. They were right on the outside last year. They want to take that next step forward. A lot of change. There's no doubt about that. There's so many different things that are changing around this team, including Dowell Loggins moving on and becoming the App State head coach. That fan base will tell you that they are going to be elite this year. That fan base will tell you that they are going to go to the CFP this year, and I don't necessarily fully disagree with them. It is going to be a tall order, and they are caught in this, sea of teams that very much want to do the very same thing. Obviously, they have a quarterback that can get them there. It's going to be a really interesting thing to watch, and definitely something that is going to inform the conversation around Shane Beamer for quite some time. Then you got Tennessee. Even with the quarterback change, they were in the CFP a year ago. The defense returns a lot of really talented guys. I think they expect to very much be in this conversation. Now, will they is obviously very much up for debate, but I do think they are a team that maybe not CFP or bust, partly because of the quarterback change and all the craziness that went on with Iamaliava. I feel like Josh Heupel has a lot of goodwill stored up with that fan base, but at the end of the day, if they went 8-4, 7-5, there would be a lot of frustration from that fan base, no doubt about it. And then Texas A&M kind of rounds this thing out. Marcel Reed in this run game is going to be one of the best in the country. I think they expected the defense to continue to take steps forward under Mike Elko, and I think this is another fan base that would tell you they expect to be in the playoff this year, or at the very least, again, expect to be in the conversation. So all these teams, it'll be varying results and it'll be varying reactions from the fan base. Maybe Auburn goes 8-4 and the fan base is totally fine. Maybe Tennessee goes 8-4 or 9-3 and the fan base is totally fine. But I know all these fan bases are looking at the CFP and saying, at the very least, why not us? In some respects, they're saying we are going to be in that group this year. Someone's going to leave disappointed. In fact, multiple of these teams are going to leave disappointed. We'll just have to figure out who those teams are going to be. Then you got teams that, in my opinion, absolutely will throw a wrench into this conference. And I got Vandy, Arkansas, and Mississippi State. Vanderbilt with Diego Pavia, I understand he's talking about a national title run and a CFP run. I think they're going to fall a little bit short of that. Respectfully, I do think it's going to be a little bit tough for them to find their way to the CFP this year. I know Diego Pavia is going to be really tough to deal with, though. And I love Cedric Alexander. They still have Junior Sherrill on the outside that makes some big-time plays. They have the best tight end in the country as far as I'm concerned, Eli Stowers. It's going to be a really good football team. And it's one of those teams that plays their game really effectively, moves the ball down the field, doesn't get ahead of themselves, doesn't panic, and they have a quarterback that leads that way. So it's going to be a team that I don't necessarily think is going to, continue what they started last year and do some incredible things this year. I do think they're going to be one of those teams that every team shows up and says, we got to be about our P's and Q's today because they will absolutely hand us a loss if we're not careful. Then you got Arkansas, and I think it's as simple as you catch Taylon Green on the wrong day, you are going to get got. He is an incredible athlete, maybe the best athlete not named Lenora Sellers in this conference. He is going to make one team pay this year. I don't know who it's going to be. I don't know where it happens. Could be Tennessee again maybe, but at the end of the day, he is going to get someone this year. That team is going to get someone this year. You just got to figure out where it's going to be because this is a very, very talented quarterback that just might not be in the best situation around him. But at the end of the day, when he gets rolling, it's very, very hard to stop. And then Mississippi State. I think this team is much better than people are giving him credit for. Now, I don't know if they're going to be elite. I don't know if they're going to get to 8 or 9 wins. I do know they're going to get... I don't know this. I feel pretty confident that they're going to sneak up on a team or two this year. There's going to be a couple of games, maybe even an out-of-conference game against an Arizona State team that is riding very high this year. But if Blake Shapen is healthy and Jeff Lebby can run the stuff that he wants to run, we know what that looks like. We know what it looked like over there at Oklahoma a couple of years ago. I think it could look something relatively similar. I don't think you have a Dylan Gabriel at quarterback by any means, but I do think you have plenty of weapons to make something interesting happen and maybe get 1 or 2 big-time upsets this year and change the conversation around Mississippi State from they're the worst team in the SEC, no doubt about it, to maybe they're a team that's putting something together under Jeff Lebby. And then I got Kentucky. And I got Kentucky all the way down at the bottom. I really hate to do it. It's not going to be a great year. It's just not a very talented team. I like Zach Calzada. I don't love Zach Calzada. I think they don't have any absolute difference makers on offense after losing, obviously, Barian Brown and Dane Key to the portal. They're in a tough spot. I'll put it that way. I just think Kentucky's one of those teams that you look at this year, I'm having a really hard time figuring out a way for them to get to a bowl game. Now, they could very well be one of those teams that throws a wrench into things. Obviously, Mark Stoops teams are always going to be very, very well coached and have the ability to make something happen any given Saturday, but it's going to be a tough challenge for them. There's no doubt about it. I think they're looking at a year that probably is relatively disappointing for Kentucky. But overall, I think all these tiers are very malleable, especially that one in the middle, the CFP or bust tier. It totally depends on what those fans are thinking. So if Auburn's not, it would be more than fine with 8 wins, that's totally fine. But I do think they at least have the CFP sort of on their mind in some respects. I think the same thing for Oklahoma, for Tennessee, especially with the offseason craziness that they had over there. I think they'd be a little bit more understanding, but absolutely, all those teams want to be in the CFP conversation. Someone's not going to be there. In fact, the number of those teams are not going to be there, and it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation around that fan base and possibly around that coach in some of those respects. But we'll talk about all of that as it unfolds. Obviously, some of those teams are going to rise to the challenge, and it's going to be really, really awesome to watch. But let's take our second break here. When we come back, let's get to some players to know. There are a ton of really talented wide receivers in this conference that I think are going to hit it big this year, and I want to talk about them all right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the conference tiers as I see it. I think the 4 teams up top, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, and LSU, are relatively set in stone. From there, you can take your best guess. As far as I'm concerned, going into this season, it's going to be a crazy conference with a lot of disappointed fans at the end of the year. Then we got to get to players to watch, because I think there's a number of guys that maybe aren't talked about on the national scale, or at the very least, not enough people know these names, and they very well should going into this season. So let's go ahead and jump into this, and let's talk about Alabama to start things off. Jalen Hale is a very interesting guy to me. When you talk about the wide receiver core over there at Alabama, it starts with Ryan Williams, of course. They brought in Isaiah Horton from the portal, who I absolutely love. I think Jeremy Bernard is going to round out the starting 3 for that group. I think this kid is uniquely talented. I think his athletic ability is totally different than just about everyone else on that team. I think he's going to be a guy that defenses just kind of lose track of when you're chasing around Ryan Williams and Isaiah Horton and Jeremy Bernard and all the other talented guys they have on that roster. I think Jalen Hale can have a big time impact. Now, I don't think he's going for 1,000 yards. I don't think he's doing anything absolutely incredible, All American level. I do think he is going to be a guy that in certain situations, in big time games, he's going to make some huge plays. He's going to be kind of that 50-50 ball, physical receiver. But at the end of the day, I think he's someone that if you're bringing him off the bench as your fourth, you're in a really good position at the wide receiver spot. And I think he's going to take a big time leap forward this year. Then you got Justin Jefferson in the linebacker room over there. 61 tackles, 2 sacks, a forced fumble a year ago. This is an elite player to have next to Deontay Lawson. Obviously, Deontay Lawson's going to play good football. That is not much of a question at this point over there in Tuscaloosa, but Justin Jefferson, adding him to that is huge. A very athletic, rangy linebacker that can play sideline to sideline, very aggressive in the run game, plays good enough in the pass coverage. I think Alabama's going to use a lot of 5 DB, so probably won't be asked to do too much in that respect, but he's one of those guys that I think can be really, really incredible this year, maybe even a first-team All-SEC type guy if he can put it all together. And if he does, this defense is going to be maybe one of the best in the entire country, maybe the best in the entire country. Arkansas, Omega Blake is the first guy I want to talk about. He started his career at South Carolina, as you can see, but did transfer over to Charlotte last year where he had almost 800 yards, 9 touchdowns on the year. This guy has to hit. They lost so many guys in that wide receiver room. Isaiah Satania moved on. Obviously, Andrew Armstrong moved on to the NFL. This guy's got to hit. He's got to be a big-time player for you. It's going to be a chunk offense. It's going to be one that hurts you with 20-yard plays. They're not necessarily, in my opinion, at the very least, are not going to be, fully in front of the chains every single time they're on the field. I think they're going to need some big plays, and this is probably the guy that's going to go get him. They brought in a number of transfer wide receivers, so any number of those guys could hit, but this is the one that I tend to like the most. A little bit of experience in the SEC and really had a great season for Charlotte a year ago. I think Omega Blake's got to be huge for this team. And then Xavier Sori is a guy that came over from Georgia a year ago and became the leader of this team almost immediately. 99 tackles a year ago, 2 sacks, 1 INT. He is someone that is going to be almost definitely the green dot guy for this team. He is going to be the leader of this defense, and he's got to be huge. This is not going to be a overly talented defense or one that totally just overwhelms teams. I think this is a guy that can totally change a game. I think if they use him a little bit more in the pass rush game, if he can get after the passer just a little bit more this year, I think this could be a special player and be one of the big-time reasons that, like we talked about earlier, Arkansas just catches someone on the wrong day and they give someone a big-time upset like they gave Tennessee a year ago. Auburn. Replacing Jarquez Hunter is going to be really, really hard. And Damari Alston is probably going to be the main guy to have to do that. 276 yards and 3 scores a year ago. If you're going to have to replace that guy, which I would argue has been one of the best running backs in the entire country over the last 2 or 3 years, it's probably going to be a little bit more by committee, but Damari Alston's going to be leading the way, and that is going to be a tall order for him. Obviously, you have crazy weapons on the outside, so that does help. Maybe a little bit of a lighter box for him to run into. Doesn't change that he's going to have to be really good for this team. If they don't have a run game and everyone can kind of just sit back and do a light box and still stop the run, you're going to have a problem for Auburn. There's no doubt about that. Jackson Arnold is going to start turning the ball over, and then you're going to kind of go down the same path you did a year ago. So Damari Alston is absolutely needed for this team, and I really like the ability that he has. Got to put it together for a whole season, which is going to be a tall order, no doubt about it. And then Keldrick Falk is one of the best defensive linemen in the entire country, and I don't think people talk about him nearly enough. 7 sacks a year ago, 45 tackles. He is as elite as they come, and I think when you look at Auburn going into this year, the defense is good. The defense is plenty talented, and DJ Durkin has done a nice job throughout the time that he's been there in upgrading pretty much every single year on the defensive side of the ball. The reality is I still think they're going to need an absolute difference maker. I still think they're going to need a guy that can totally take over a game, get 2 or 3 sacks, maybe a forced fumble, just really, really dominate a team on the defensive side of the ball. I think it's going to be Keldrick Falk. I don't know if they have many other choices really to take over that role other than Keldrick Falk, and they're going to win some of these big-time games that they're going to have to if they want to get to the CFP. Keldrick Falk's going to have to be an all-SEC level player. Florida, Jaden Baugh is someone that I thought the entire country knew about, And apparently they don't. There has been not nearly enough talk about this kid. He is one of the best running backs in the entire country as far as I'm concerned. 673 yards, 7 touchdowns as a freshman last year. This guy's a freak. He's an absolute freak of nature. He has Jacoby Jackson to go with him to kind of keep him healthy throughout the year and not totally run him into the ground. He's got to be able to help out DJ Lagway, especially early on in the season as he's getting a little bit more healthy and a little bit more comfortable. This guy's incredible, and he's one of those guys that I think could be an All-American guy this year if Florida can put it all together on offense. Obviously, if DJ Lagway goes out, those boxes get a little bit more stacked very quickly. So that's going to be an interesting thing to follow, but in terms of elite running back talent in this conference, you're going to be hard-pressed to find one outright better than Jaden Ball. And then Caleb Banks on the other side, 21 tackles, 4.5 sacks, a forced fumble, a year ago, 6'6", long, physical, one of those guys that I think is going to take the world by storm this year. Now, if you're a Florida Gator fan, you feel like he's already done that. He's an incredible, incredible player, pops up on the page every single time the Gators play, but in a national sense, I don't think he's talked about nearly enough. One of the better defensive tackles in the entire country, and one of those guys, kind of like what we talked about with Keldrick Falk, although relatively different positions on that defensive line, he can totally take over games. Him and Tyreek Sapp are two guys that I think on that defensive line for Florida, that's part of the reason I think they could be so special this year is I think they can get after the passer, and then they're going to be able to run the football with Jaden Ball and Jacoby Jackson, and it's going to be a really interesting team to watch. Obviously, all of it hinges on DJ Lagway, but these two guys will have plenty to do with that as well. Moving forward to Georgia, Colby Young is going to be massive. I think everyone talks about Georgia's wide receiver core. They talk about Zachariah Branch and Noah Thomas and all these other guys that they brought in from the portal that are going to be big-time players, no doubt about it. This might be the best wide receiver on the roster, at least from early returns in fall camp, would suggest that. He had some tough times last year, had a little bit of a legal situation that played out throughout last year. He has been totally absolved of that, and he's really taken it seriously since he's gotten back on the field. Apparently, he's a big-time leader for this team when they very much need it in that wide receiver room. He has been playing some really, really great football at fall camp, and he's one of those guys that when he is on the field and making plays, it's very clear the physical ability. He has such a ability to go up and get 50-50 balls, is a little bit faster than I thought he was going to be, frankly, coming into Georgia, but he's one of those guys that when you have a Zachariah Branch that can make a 2-yard gain into a 60-yard gain in the second, and you have a Noah Thomas that is such a complete player, also can be a 50-50 guy. You can play around with Colby Young as you see fit, and he's a very, very fun guy to play around with. I do think he's going to be a really special player for Georgia this upcoming year. Then you got Ella Modozie, a guy you brought in from Army this offseason. He is fast, he is bendy, he is going to be super freed up in the pass rush game because he obviously doesn't have to play every single down for Georgia. They have about 1,000,001 guys coming off the edge this year. There are so many different guys that they're going to rotate into that position. I think Ella Modozie is going to be as impactful as any of them. I think he's going to be a huge player on third down and pass rush. I think he's plenty good at playing the run, but it's one of those guys that if you have the ability to just unlock him on third downs, especially long third downs when he can just get after the quarterback, he could get to double-digit sacks this year. That's how good this kid is, and I think it's going to really benefit him not having to be the down-in, down-out defensive end for a team and just be able to let his raw athletic ability take over on third down. Moving over to Kentucky, the team that I'm not too high on, Jamarian Wilcox is someone I absolutely love, actually. 590 yards, 2 scores a year ago. They need a run game. If they are going to be a successful team, they're going to have to be able to run the ball effectively, give Zach Calzada a little bit of time to get comfortable or reacquainted, I should say, to the SEC style of play. And really, this is a guy that I think could be a star. I really do think he is a 1,000-yard rusher type player. Will the offensive line help him out enough is a big-time question mark, but at the end of the day, I think this guy is uniquely talented, just happens to be in a situation that maybe doesn't highlight quite as well as some of these other running backs in this conference. Then you got Alex Afari Jr., one of my favorite players in the entire country. He started over there at safety, but has kind of come down and played linebacker more lately, is officially listed as a linebacker going into this year, 62 tackles a year ago, 1.5 sacks, a very rangy player. You can play around with him a lot in the pass game, in the run game. I really like this piece. I think there's a chess piece for the defensive coordinator over there, and I think he's someone that no matter where you put him, he is going to be able to make a play very fast. One of those guys that athleticism just is off the charts for this kid. I think he's going to be a huge player for this team, and probably has to be if they're going to have any success this year. Moving forward to LSU, Chris Hilton Jr. is kind of stealing the show, kind of the same way we talked about Colby Young. We're talking about Chris Hilton, where you have tons of transfer wide receivers, and Barry and Brown, and I'm blanking on the guy's name from Oklahoma. But at the end of the day, you have a number of guys coming in from a number of different places this upcoming year at the wide receiver position. Chris Hilton seems to be kind of balling out right now, and he's a huge player for them, a big-time down-the-field threat, one of those guys that can totally change the complexion of the game in a second. I think he's going to be huge this year. Gary Nussmeier really liked throwing to him last year. There were some drop troubles. There were a little bit of injury. He can absolutely unlock everything this year, and especially with Adam Anderson being kind of the main guy there, Barry and Brown getting a ton of attention, Nick Anderson was what I was looking for, coming over from Oklahoma getting a ton of attention. I think this guy's going to be a huge player for LSU this year. And then Mansour Deline is a really, really interesting guy for me. I think he's going to make play after play for this team, and he really has to. He's the corner that came in from Virginia Tech, had 4 INTs, 7 pass deflections a year ago. He's going to start, and he's got to be the leader of this back end. He's got to play pretty elite football. Not necessarily, total lockdown, but when you look across the rest of the cornerback room, they have some talented guys. They also have a lot of really young guys, whether you want to talk about PJ Woodland or Ashton Stamps or a number of other players. Mansour Deline's probably going to have to be the guy in terms of he's going to have to be on the field as consistently as any of the cornerbacks, and he's going to have to be able to hold down some elite wide receivers across this conference, including Ryan Williams and possibly, a Ryan Wingo in a SEC championship game or something like that. It's a huge player, maybe as important of a defensive player as you'll find on LSU this year. Mississippi State, the team that I'm watching very closely this year, they added Anthony Evans III, and this is a very interesting player, only 88 yards a year ago, but is a very dynamic punt returner, and is one of those guys that every time he had the ball in his hands for Georgia, it just felt like something special could possibly happen. Now, never really put it all together, obviously had some troubles getting on the field for a number of different reasons. Very talented kid, and he will get on the field for Mississippi State this year. I think he's going to be one of the main targets right next to Brennan Thompson, and I just think this guy has a lot to give. I think Mississippi State, especially with Jeff Lebby, can really unlock this guy and allow him to maybe not have, a 1,000-yard season or anything crazy. I think he could be a great piece for that team, and I can almost promise you he's going to make some special teams plays this year. And then Jamil Burroughs, coming over from Alabama, just never really got his chance over there at Alabama. As you can imagine, a number of cases with Alabama defensive tackles, but 8 tackles, 1 sack a year ago. He really does need to hit. If Mississippi State's going to be an effective team and be able to pill off some of those upsets like I talked about a little bit earlier, they got to be able to stop the run and at least stay in front of the chains, at least put their defense in manageable situations, and I think those guys up front are going to be huge, especially Jamil Burroughs. Missouri is a very, very interesting team. They brought in maybe the transfer of the entire offseason, of the entire conference this offseason, Ahmad Hardy coming over from ULM, the running back, over 1,300 yards a year ago, 13 touchdowns as a freshman. This kid's a freak, and frankly, it might have just been a misevaluation by some of those services out there because he was a freak from the get-go last year, and he is an incredible player. I think he's going to come into Missouri, maybe even lead the conference in rushing. That's something we can talk about a little bit later, but he's a very, very talented player, and one of those guys that, again, with Missouri, you breaking in a new quarterback, whether it's Pribble or Horn, you're going to have a run game. That run game is so important to what Missouri does. That was a big reason why they took a step back a year ago, was that run game really didn't give the pass game many openings. It's got to this year, and Ahmad Hardy is going to be a huge piece of that. And then Marvin Burks Jr. is a guy that I don't think a lot of people know the name of. You really should. He's going to be an NFL player here pretty soon, but for the meantime, he had 66 tackles, 1 INT, 2 pass deflections a year ago. He's got to be huge for this team. He is going to be tasked with covering probably the best receiver every single week, week in and week out, and in a manageable schedule. If they can get a good run game with Ahmad Hardy and a good pass defense that takes the ball away a couple of times with Marvin Burks and company, It's going to be a special team up there in Missouri. Go 10-2, go 11-1, be firmly in the CFP, and we'll see what happens from there. Obviously, a lot of other moving parts, but these two guys are going to have everything to say about what Missouri does this year. Moving forward to Oklahoma, Deion Burks just has to be healthy. If Deion Burks is on the field, he is going to be one of the better wide receivers in this entire conference. I think he's an absolute freak of nature. I think especially with a guy like John Mateer is going to be very effective after the catch. I think he is such a weapon that they can use and kind of a gadget that they can play around with depending on what they get from other wide receivers that will have to help out quite a bit. But Deion Burks is uniquely talented and one of those guys that if he didn't get injured last year, I think he takes the world by storm in different times last year. Obviously, quarterback play hurt him just a little bit as well, but I think he's going to be totally fine this year. As long as he is on the field, I think he's going to do special things for this Oklahoma football team. Jaden Jackson, the exact same thing. Now, he didn't necessarily have injury troubles last year. He was just a freshman, but this kid's a freak of nature in every sense of the word. He is going to be an absolute force this year. I don't care what offensive line he is facing, all the way up from Alabama down to, I don't know who the worst team they play is, but whoever that is, he's going to dominate them all. A very, very good player. One of those guys that's still kind of budding into a star, still kind of finding his stripes, but he's forceful in every sense of the word. He is going to be an absolute beast this year, and I think he's going to be someone that when you talk about the Oklahoma team as a whole, really, you start with that defensive line, and you really start with Jaden Jackson in a lot of cases, an incredible player that is still developing into the player that he's going to become. Ole Miss, Deuce Alexander is a really interesting name. Coming over from Wake Forest, was a very, very highly touted recruit coming out of high school. Sounds like he's turning heads. Lane Kiffin has been very, very complimentary of this kid since he's come over. They have a lot of talented players in that wide receiver room, as you can imagine. Caden Lee leading the way, Deshaun Stribling coming in from Oklahoma State. You add Harrison Wallace from Penn State. I think Deuce Alexander could steal one of those spots from one of those guys. Probably Harrison Wallace if I had to guess, but Deuce Alexander is a very, very talented kid. Maybe it won't be right away. Maybe he won't start the first game of the season, but I do think he's going to be a force for this team. Doesn't even necessarily have to be, but I do think he's going to be a big-time player for them. And then Prince Williman taking over for his brother Princely. Obviously, you'd love to keep that level of production. Now, obviously, Prince Will is a little bit less known and less experienced in this role. Only a half sack a year ago for Nebraska. A little bit of injury stuff, some different things that went into that, but they got to unlock this kid. He has unique athletic ability, is same as his brother, and he's absolutely someone that could be a big-time force for this team that I think is looking for that big-time pass rusher. I love what Suntarine Perkins can bring to the table, but I do think there are a little bit of you kind of want to play around with him just a little bit, and it really helps when you have a Prince Williman that can just go after the quarterback. You don't have to worry about Perkins, and you can kind of play around with him as you see fit. South Carolina, if Nick Harbor is not a big-time player this year, South Carolina is going to fall off a cliff. I'll say that as plainly as it needs to be said. They don't have the wide receiver talent around him to where he cannot miss in any way. He had 376 yards, 3 touchdowns a year ago. The big development here is he was a dual sport athlete at South Carolina for the first couple of years, playing football as well as running track. Just ridiculous speed on this kid, especially for his size. He is now fully focused on football. So is that the difference maker where he can finally make that jump that I think South Carolina fans really expected to get in his freshman year? He is finally fully focused on football, and I think he's a guy that if he doesn't hit, I think this offense could just be Lenore Sellers doing his best to keep them in games while everyone else just kind of rides on his back. But I do think Nick Harbor has all the ability to become that elite player. I think he might be one of the more important players on this list that we're breaking down. And then Brian Thomas Jr., kind of the same talking point. Kyle Kennard walked out the door. You need someone to replace him. Obviously, Dylan Stewart's going to be a nightmare. I don't think we have to talk about Dylan Stewart too much. Everyone knows that's going to be one of the best players in the entire country. But Brian Thomas Jr., 4.5 sacks a year ago, a forced fumble. If he can take that next step forward, it's going to be as good of a duo as they had last year. As crazy as that sounds with how forceful that duo was and how good Kyle Kennard was, I do think it's one of those situations where last year it was Kyle Kennard kind of leading the way with Dylan Stewart filling in where they needed to. I think it's now Dylan Stewart leading the way with maybe Brian Thomas filling in where they kind of need him to. and this guy can turn into a superstar as well. So there is so much ability in that room for South Carolina. I think Brian Thomas is the guy that really has to unlock I don't want to say spectacular season, but a very solid season for South Carolina to be the force that they were last year in the pass rush game. Tennessee, David Sanders Jr. is the only offensive lineman I've broken down in this entire week when we're talking about predictions, but he's super important. He's starting at left tackle as a freshman for this team. This offensive line is a little bit all over the place. I do think they're going to be more than fine. I think they're going to play good football, but he's got to hit the ground running. If he doesn't, then things could get bad in a hurry, especially in a run game, because the reality is they're going to need that run game very, very aggressively. Whether it's Deshaun Bishop or Peyton Lewis or any number of guys in the backfield, they're going to need to get that going because Josh Heupel offenses don't really work if you don't have that run game going. David Sanders Jr. is going to be a huge piece of that, along with the other four guys next to him, of course, but he's taking over for a big, big name, and he's going to have to be able to step into those shoes and at the very least fill him. Not necessarily be an elite player and totally just shut down everyone, but maybe a Kelvin Banks, Will Campbell type freshman year where it looks really good at times. Sometimes there's some struggles, but overall is a very, very talented kid, and I think they paid him quite a bit of money, so he's got to be ready to roll, as we all know. And then Joshua Josephs, forgot to add the S on the end there, but 39 tackles, 1.5 sacks, 3 forced fumbles a year ago. This guy's got to be a force. You lose James Pierce Jr. to the NFL, he's now on my Atlanta Falcons, and I think you're going to have to get that production from someone because the reality is I love the back end of this defense. Without Jermon McCoy, you do have questions, and he probably won't be playing for the first couple of weeks. You're going to have to get after the quarterback, and you're going to have to get after him pretty consistently just to help out that group. I don't think they're going to need to be totally lifted up by the pass rush. I do think they're going to need just a little bit of help from time to time, and I think Joshua Josephs is going to be a huge player for that role. Texas A&M. Casey Concepcion is not a name that enough people know, and I think it's probably the fault of NC State, with all due respect to the Wolfpack. 460 yards a year ago, 6 touchdowns. The quarterback play did not quite meet the level of the wide receiver play over there for the Wolfpack a year ago. He's found his way to Texas A&M. This kid's special. He has unique speed. He's very, very shifty, and I think he's one of those guys that if you can get him the ball early and often this year, he could go for 1,000 yards. I think he is that level of player. I think he's an all-SEC level player at wide receiver, and A&M probably needs him to be that guy. You lose Noah Thomas from a year ago. You lose a number of other guys from that wide receiver room. You replaced with really, really good talent. I think this guy's going to have to be the one that leads the way in a number of different categories, and I think he very well can. I think he could have last year at NC State if things just worked out a little bit smoother at the quarterback position. And then Julian Humphrey comes over from UGA, a little bit infamous from that Ryan Williams play that made him look just a little bit goofy at times, but at the end of the day, very talented kid. He's someone that I think they need to hit. They have Will Lee on one side of the ball. He is going to be great. I have no questions about that. I think Julian Humphrey is a little bit more questionable, but he's going to have to hold down the other side. And if he can do it to a high level, this is going to be a really good back end and a very elite defense at the end of the year. And then Texas. Parker Livingstone is a guy you're going to want to know has really broken out over spring and fall camp, is one of those guys that it seemed like they were bringing in Emmett Mosley from the portal to really get a starting position. Parker Livingstone might just steal that from him. He's a very, very talented kid, has kind of gone through the process, although he's only been there 1 year, has kind of gone through the process, and they really like this kid. They're giving him a lot of reps with Team 1, and I think he's going to be a big-time player for them. Him and Arch Manning are very, very comfortable together, have a very good rapport. I think it's going to be a big-time player for this football team this year. Obviously, Ryan Wingo, DeAndre Moore, all those guys lead the way, but I think Parker Livingstone is going to end up being a big-time player for this team. And then Jelani McDonald. He's kind of the Andrew Makuba for this year for Texas, uniquely athletic. He was a track athlete coming out of high school, did long jump, did high jump, did sprints. He is one of the best athletes you're going to find in the SEC, and you probably don't know the name of him right now. You will. He's going to make 1 or 2 plays this year that are going to be all over SportsCenter. I can almost promise you that. Really, really good athletic ability, really rangy, can play a number of different positions. Was down in kind of the nickel position last year, is now going to be a little bit deeper at the safety position, and I think he's going to be a nightmare. I think he's going to be a very, very good player for Texas over the next 2 years. I think he hits the ground running this year. And then Vanderbilt to round this thing out. Cedric Alexander is a uniquely important player for Vanderbilt this year. When you lose some of the pieces they lost on the outside, you're going to need a good run game. And at the end of last year, it really did start to feel like people kind of caught on to what Vanderbilt was doing. Now, obviously, you can get that back this year. You can play really good football. You can get back to the run game that you love. But there was a lot of questions around this team, and I think Cedric Alexander can erase a lot of those questions. If he can up that 586 to 850, let's say, this upcoming year and do some really special things, I think this offense, while maybe not quite as potent as it was a year ago, can be very, very steady. And then on the defensive side of the ball, Martel Height is going to be a huge player for this team. 33 tackles, 1 forced fumble, 2 INTs, 4 pass deflections a year ago. This team's going to have to get takeaways. They're going to have to do what they did against Alabama, which is force some problems up front, get some big-time takeaways on the back end, and then run the clock. And these two guys are going to be super important for both sides of that. So going to be really interesting to see what they can do. If Vanderbilt's going to be a special team this year, obviously Diego Pavia is leading the way, but Martel Height and Cedric Alexander are not too far behind him. I can promise you that. So a lot of players to watch. I think there's so many guys that I didn't even have a chance to get into during that segment that are going to make big-time impacts for their team, but I think that group is a really special group. I think there's wide receivers in there like Deion Burks, like Parker Livingstone, like Omega Blake, like Jalen Hale that you might not be talking about too much right now, and you'll be talking about them a lot come week 6, week 7 when we get into the SEC schedule just a little bit. So going to be really awesome to watch all of those guys develop. We'll see if any of them become outright superstars this upcoming year, and I think a couple of them have the ability to do that. But let's take our last break here, and when we come back, it's all about picking superlatives. We'll give all the superlatives out: game of the year, surprise team of the year, disappointing team of the year, all that good stuff. And then finally, my conference championship matchup and my pick to win the SEC in 2025. So stick with us and we'll be right back with that. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about players to watch. All around this conference, there are so many talented wide receivers, and a number of them I didn't even get a chance to get to in that last segment. But at the end of the day, all those players are going to be really, really fun to watch. I'm keeping a very close eye on Deion Burks over there at Oklahoma. If they're going to hit at the level that they very much want to this year, he's going to have to be a huge piece of that. So that'll be a fun one to watch, no doubt about it. Let's get into some picks, why don't we? We have so many different things to break down in this conference, and I have a championship pick that I don't know if people are going to love too much, but we'll get to that at the very end. For now, game of the year, it's Alabama at Georgia. As far as I'm concerned, these are the two teams that define this conference until further notice. These are the two teams, this is the matchup that will define this conference for a very long time, as far as I'm concerned. And this time, Alabama does go to Georgia. Georgia has a very impressive home winning record going right now. I believe 29 games, somewhere in that kind of ballpark. Alabama would love to ruin that. There's no doubt about it. Kirby Smart would love to get over the hump that has been Alabama. We thought it was Kirby Smart for a long time, and then last year made it look a little bit worse. So they're obviously trying to get back on track over there in Athens, and this would be a huge one for both these teams, really, because both these teams are very likely to start undefeated, be undefeated once this game comes around. Alabama does have Florida State and Wisconsin, so maybe there's a little bit of a shakeup there, but I'd be a little bit surprised. This is a marquee matchup, and if Georgia loses this one, they're in a very, very precarious place with still Texas coming up, with still Ole Miss coming up in Florida. Alabama, if they lose this one, they're in a little bit of a precarious position. They got LSU, they got Tennessee, they got Auburn at the end of the year that very much wants to knock them out of the CFP if they get the chance again. So it's one of those situations where, as far as I'm concerned, these are the two teams that define this conference right now. Whenever they match up in the regular season, it is the game of the year. Obviously, Texas-Georgia is going to be in this. Alabama-LSU was a part of this conversation, but Alabama-Georgia is the defining game of this conference over the last decade. I think it's going to be that way in this year as well. Florida at LSU on September 13th is my underrated, I suppose, game of the year. You could call it underrated, overlooked, whatever. I think it's a tone setter for this conference in a number of different ways. Let's say DJ Lagway's healthy, and they go into Baton Rouge and they get a huge win on the road at LSU. I think everyone's looking up. I think everyone's looking over their shoulder at Florida and saying, that it might be just a CFP team, especially if they've done incredible things and beaten Miami before, or this might be after or before the Miami game, weirdly enough. But at the end of the day, if they're undefeated coming out of this matchup and they have beaten LSU, they will be looked at as a CFP contender. There's no two ways about that. If LSU wins, I think they're in a really good spot for the CFP, even if they were to lose that first game to Clemson, especially if they were to win that first game against Clemson. Then you're in a position where you might run away with this conference. Now, obviously, quite a bit of work to be done the rest of the way, but I think when you look at this conference, there's a number of teams that are kind of vying for that fourth spot. I think Florida's one of those teams that could possibly pop up into that spot. I think LSU is one of those teams that could just stick where they are right now at 4, and I think they could very well vault up to number 1. I think this is going to be a game that kind of decides the direction for both these teams the rest of the year. Disappointing team of the year, I'm going to go with South Carolina. And this is a little bit interesting because I don't think it's going to be a bad team. I think Lenore Sellers is probably good for about 7 or 8 wins by himself, frankly. But I do think we're underestimating some of the departures on defense and wide receiver. I think when you lose guys on the back end like Nick Eamon-Worry, it's not easy to replace. I think when you lose a guy like Demetrius Knight Jr., it is going to be a nightmare to replace that guy both on and off the field. And then the wide receiver room. If Nick Harbor can put it together, great. I think that's going to be a really solid player. I think he's going to have to be if this team's going to be successful. But outside of that, I don't feel confident in really any of those players, and I'd be lying if I said I feel really confident about Nick Harbor hitting this year. So the way I look at South Carolina is a uniquely talented quarterback that's surrounded by a lot of questions. And I do think they have the ability to be a good team. I also think Dowell Loggins moving on is a little bit bigger of a deal than it's being made out to be right now. I just think it's going to be a step back. I don't necessarily think they're going to bottom out and go 5-7 or anything crazy. I do think they could go 8-4, 7-5, and be very disappointed after a year where they definitely felt like they were going to make a run at a possible CFP. My surprise team of the year is the Florida Gators, and I'm going to do it. It might be a mistake, and people are more than welcome to laugh at me if it is, but this team is really, really talented all across the football team. DJ Lagway, if he is healthy, he's one of the best quarterbacks in the entire country as far as I'm concerned. They have the ability to pull this off. Obviously, it is a little bit contingent on DJ Lagway being healthy and being on the field for me, but at the end of the day, I think when you look at this team across the board, I think the run game is going to be about as good as you're going to find in this conference, maybe the best in this conference. A&M will have something to say about that, but at the end of the day, they're going to have a very good run game. I love the offensive line, especially Jake Slaughter in the middle, of course. Love Caleb Banks and Tyreek Sapp on the defensive side of the ball. I think the wide receiver room, even without Dallas Wilson, now you would love to get him back as soon as possible, but even without him, I think they have plenty of talent in that room to make it happen. Billy Napier's got to be a little bit better. I don't think there's any question about that. I don't think anyone's, going against that. But I do think there's going to be moments this year where we look up and you say, Florida's in a better position than I thought they were going to be, and they might go down to the wire as one of those teams that is right around the CFP and one big-time win away from possibly joining the CFP towards the end of the year. Elijah Griffin, defensive tackle over at Georgia, is my freshman of the year as far as I'm concerned. A freak of nature in every sense of the word. When you talk about a kid that comes into Georgia as a defensive tackle, you're usually talking about him in the future. You're usually talking about him as a traits guy that you can unlock in his sophomore or junior year because there's so many talented guys in front of him. Now, there's still talented guys in front of him, whether you want to talk about Christian Miller or Jordan Hall or any number of guys for Georgia. He's going to play, and he's going to play a whole lot. I think he has a Jalen Carter level player in his career, not necessarily this year, but I do think he's going to start really strong. He's going to be an absolute force in the middle for that team. I think when you look at the defensive tackle group for Georgia, comparative to years before, not quite as strong, not quite as deep as it has been before. This guy's going to make that a non-problem as far as I'm concerned. I think him, along with Christian Miller and a couple other guys, are going to make that group plenty good, and I think Elijah Griffin probably going to be a starter right next to Christian Miller by the end of the year. My transfer of the year is Isaiah Horton, the wide receiver over there at Alabama. I loved this pickup from Alabama. I like Jeremy Bernard. I think Ryan Williams is going to be a star in this league. I think they needed a guy that was just a little bit of everything, that had the route running ability, that wasn't, was more than comfortable to take the underneath routes and make something out of them. Not necessarily the outright over-the-top guy, but just a really professional player. And they talk about him that way in practice. They say he's probably the best route runner in the entire group, and it's a lot of good route runners in that wide receiver group. So I think he's going to be a huge target for Ty Simpson, especially a guy that I don't expect to be, a uniquely incredible player, passer down the field. I think Isaiah Horton's going to be a huge player for this team, and I think he's going to rack up some really, really impressive stats this year, maybe even outdo Ryan Williams. I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but I think this guy has that level of ability, and I think he could put on a show this year for the Crimson Tide. Offensive Player of the Year, I'm going to go with Garrett Nussmeier, and I think there's a number of different guys you could go for with this spot. The way that I look at it is I think this LSU defense is going to be better. I think they're going to make improvements. It's almost inevitable with the talent level and Blake Baker getting more comfortable in that position. I still think they're going to have to score some points. I still think they're going to be put kind of feet to the fire, have to make some big-time plays down the stretch of games. I think Garrett Nussmeier will make those plays. I think he's going to temper down some of the interception troubles that he had a year ago. I think the wide receiver core is better around him than it was a year ago, and I think this kid's going to put on a show. I'll be totally honest. I think he's going to do an incredible, incredible job running this offense, and I think it's an offense that, as long as you run it really well, you're going to put up some crazy numbers. I think Garrett Nussmeier wins Offensive Player of the Year in a year where I think defenses probably dominate this conference. I think Garrett Nussmeier kind of shines through in a lot of ways. Defensive Player of the Year was Colin Simmons, and I thought about Anthony Hill here. Frankly, I just went between those two. I think there's some other great options around the conference, but those two guys to me are absolute difference makers. I'm going to go with Colin Simmons. He had 9 sacks a year ago, and he didn't play every snap until much later in the year. He was mainly a third down, pass down type guy that they would bring off the bench and let him go to work. And he had was very forceful very early on in the year, made plays pretty much throughout the year. But now he's going to be on the field just about every snap. Now, the edge room is incredibly, incredibly talented and deep at Texas, so he will be rotating off the field plenty, but he's going to be on the field much more than he was a year ago. I think this guy can get to 14 or 15 sacks this year. I think he is that level of good. I think he's going to put up some incredible, incredible numbers, and I think by the end of the season, you're going to look up and say, man, Texas really maybe hasn't even fully unlocked that offense, and they're still winning games pretty comfortably. It's going to be in large part because of Colin Simmons and really the rest of the pass rush around Texas. I'm going to go with Billy Napier for Coach of the Year. I'm buying in. I'm going to go down with the ship this year. It might just be a little bit muddy at times, and especially if DJ Lagway isn't healthy, this one's going to get sketchy fast. But at the end of the day, I think he's going to keep things afloat. I think he's going to do some really, really good coaching this year. I think he has the talent in front of him. I think he knows what the quarterback he has. As long as that guy is on the field, I think Billy Napier in Florida can do some special things this year. I think he's going to be someone that totally changes his image in the national headlines this upcoming year, from a guy that just can't hack it in the SEC to a guy that might be building something pretty special down there in Gainesville. Obviously a very thin line with the injury trouble that DJ Lagway has had, but I think they're going to be more than fine there, and I think Billy Napier really changes the narrative around him this year. My championship matchup is Alabama versus Texas. I know it sounds a little bit crazy with some people, but Alabama has a football team. They have a very, very good defense, one of the best in the entire country. I think the team on the other side has the best in the entire country. In Texas, I think Arch Manning is going to work out enough. I think there's going to be some bumps along the way. There's going to be some moments, even in that first game, where it looks like he's making his first couple of starts as a real starter for Texas. But at the end of the day, I think these two teams have the defenses. I think they have the head coaches and the play callers. I think they have the weapons on the outside to just make everything easier on these new quarterbacks. I think they end up meeting in Atlanta. I think Texas gets back to Atlanta for a second year in a row, and I think they lose for a second year in a row. I think Alabama Crimson Tide win the SEC this upcoming year. I love the offensive line. I think it's the very best in the entire country, maybe right up there with Penn State, kind of battling for that number one spot. I think the defensive line is not too far off with LT Overton, all those beasts on that side. The wide receiver room is really, really special with Ryan Williams and Isaiah Horton and Jeremy Bernard. I think people are going to have to delete some Kalen DeBoer tweets. I think he's very, very good at what he does. I think reuniting with Ryan Grubb is a huge thing for this team. I think Alabama wins this conference, and I think a lot of people in SEC country are very upset about that. But at the end of the day, it's going to be an all-over-the-place conference. I could see maybe 6 or 7 teams finding a way to win this thing. Probably those top 4 have the best odds by a pretty comfortable margin in my mind, but at the end of the day, I think it's going to be all over the place. I think the team that has dominated this conference for quite some time finds its way right back to the top of it, and it's going to be the Alabama Crimson Tide. As upsetting as that might sound for some people out there, I think they have a very good team. I think they have a fantastic head coach that people have just written off a little too quickly. But this is going to be an incredible season. There's no two ways about that. I love all these conferences. I think all of these conferences are going to be very hotly debated towards the end of the year. All of them have teams that can come out of nowhere and make some big-time plays and really become a CFP team throughout this year. It's going to be all over the place. It is going to be absolutely crazy. And tomorrow, we'll do a little bit of a wrap-up. We'll talk about, all of my picks from this past week. We'll do, just kind of a rundown of everything I picked. I think I'm going to delay my playoff picks and my Heisman pick until Monday just to give myself a little bit more time to fully kind of form those opinions. And there's a lot of stuff to talk about. I want to talk about all the quarterbacks that were named their starter, including a guy up there at Boston College that I think could do some really special things this year. Want to talk about that tomorrow. John Gruden, interested in coaching in the SEC. Want to get into that a little bit, and a number of other stuff, maybe a little bit more Arch Manning talk. As upsetting as that might be for some people, I want to talk about how some people are just setting him up for failure. But we'll talk about all that tomorrow. We'll get into all of that craziness. And then on Monday, I promise I will give my full picks for this upcoming season and the playoff and the Heisman and all of that good stuff on Monday. But I just had enough stuff I wanted to talk about, including the AP poll tomorrow. So we'll get all of that off our chest tomorrow. Thank you so much for tuning in to all of the preview shows. Means the world to me. Please do like, comment, subscribe, do all of that good stuff. Really does help me out over here, and would love to keep doing this for y'all. Absolutely will. As we get closer to the season, only 9 days out, and you can almost taste it. So cannot wait for this thing to get underway. Those are all of my conference picks as of right now. We'll get to my playoff picks on Monday, but I will see you guys tomorrow to talk about all of the craziness that has happened throughout this week as I've been picking all this stuff. So thank you once again for listening in. I'll see you guys tomorrow.